Next session is going to be kind of exciting one. We have planned to have a panel discussion with Kanchana, yeah, all of you know now, who is the main organizer, VP and GM at WSO2, Eric, who is the CTO at WSO2, and we have Murali from Data Paluru. And also here with me Chamod and Kavisha to continue the discussion with our panel. I think first of all, let's get to know how we started our container plus Kubernetes journey. From my end, I also joined a company called Platformer for my internship in 2018, where Kanchana was the co-founder. And I still remember, on that day, I got an opportunity to join the first ever Kubernetes Sri Lanka meetup organized by Platformer together with Kubernetes Sri Lanka community. Honestly, I don't have idea about those sessions that had it on that day, but I was trying to understand by Googling and some other ways what's this Kubernetes and why we need to use it. So while I'm working, one of my colleagues shared a Docker fundamental Udemy course. I was super excited to learn about it. Then I was working with the platform team by building content products. And I'm currently working at Eternum on different Kubernetes projects. How about you, John?
Mine is a bit similar to Kemila's, and I started learning about Kubernetes from Kubernetes Sri Lanka meetup group. But about containers, I learned by trying out Google Quick Labs and Docker Playground. Anything to add, Kavisha?
Yeah, Chamod. When I was hearing about your stories, actually I was an undergraduate. I got to know about the topic Kubernetes. But I already know about the containers and Docker. When I was working in a group project, at that time, I was trying to troubleshoot in an app which was working on my laptop, but not working in my friend's laptop due to a dependency issue. It made me to Googling a solution, and I was able to solve the issue by containerizing the application. Yeah, that was pretty much about me. How about you, Kanchana?
So my journey actually goes really long way back, but it didn't actually kind of end there. This was the days of when Sun Solaris had zones, so BSD, jails, what have you. But it was very challenging to use. It didn't call containerization. It was kind of like separating what you're running within a physical machine, and practically kind of everyone gave up. But then when Docker started in 2013, I got really hooked into it. And then over time, as Docker matures, I was building our own company, Platformer, and then we were kind of very close to building what Borg was, Kubernetes was going to build. But when we heard about Google kind of working this, we decided we actually kind of put our efforts into work with them and actually build our platform around Kubernetes, right? So I think it was kind of 20 plus years ago, start and stop, because it was very hard to use containers back then, which wasn't really called containers, but most recently with the advancement of Docker and so on and so forth, that was kind of my journeys. But over the last 7-8 years, I have seen significant improvement in this, and will continue to evolve.
Well, I trace it back to a presentation again at HPTS in 2007 from Google, where they explained the decisions to create their commodity data center architecture. And I realized from that they had reinvented IT, and we needed to think about moving all of our systems over because they had created the most cost-effective, scalable infrastructure. There were implications for all software, and this is why we have cloud-native software, why we have Kafka instead of MQ, and why we have NoSQL instead of SQL, because not only applications had to be reinvented, but the system software as well, because the different way in which the infrastructure worked and the software on top of it to isolate the applications from the constant failure of consumer-grade hardware. Adrian Cockcroft was at the same presentation. I've known him for many years as well. When he was at Sun, I was at Digital, and I followed his journey to Netflix very closely. And from that, when I got to City, decided to follow Netflix. Adrian came to talk with us several times, and he was the one who told us about Docker And he said, this has solved the problem of containerization. The next big challenge is container orchestration, which turned out to be Kubernetes. And during that time, I was working primarily on service-oriented architecture designs and implementations, first at Credit Suisse, where I went after I was at Iona. They were a big customer of Iona's to help there. And then at Citi, but I had an interview with the CIO one time, to catch up, and he asked what I was working on. I told him about SOA and managed evolution, modernizing IT systems, and he said, I don't want you to do that. You might break something. No, we're not going to break anything. He said, but you might, so I'm not sure you should do that. So I said, well, what about this stuff Google is doing? Are you interested in that? He said, oh yes, that sounds really interesting. So he allowed me to sponsor a project to redesign our payment processing systems using microservices in the cloud. So we spent several months doing this, and instead of batch-based, we had events-based microservices. Then we set out to find the implementation. We had first evaluated Cloud Foundry, couldn't get it to work. Then we got OpenShift, and that worked, and then we started our journey on that. And coming to WSO2, I found when I spoke with Sanjeeva, so just about 2 years ago now, what he was working on for Ballerina and Choreo in the area of cloud native solves a huge problem that we found at Citi, which was even if we understood the benefits of getting payment processing systems to the cloud to have the scale up, the auto scale and scale down for seasonal workloads, we had a huge challenge understanding how to do it, getting people who understood the difference between microservice and monoliths and how to recode them. And the stuff that we're working on WSO2 really should help with that in a great way. So this is kind of where I am on that journey, and I hope it's going to have a good ending.
Thank you, Eric. Murali, you want to answer?
Yeah, so Kanchana and Eric shared a lot of historical points, so I will cut down on the history part, but I would say I formally joined the bandwagon in probably like mid-2015, when I started looking at Docker, and then I joined a startup. We were trying to build a container as service platform, and that kind of didn't pan out, and I was looking around, and at the time there were not many options, right? Like Docker itself, and then Apsara and Rancher, and finally I decided Rancher is a great place to work on container stuff, and it has been an amazing journey for almost like 5.5 years. And even now in the current startup that I'm working at, we are still using containers for various things. So it's still an ongoing journey.
Yes.
It is an ongoing journey. That's right. Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, both of you. Back to the panel. Back to the
thank you very much, Kanchana. All right, let's move on to the questions that we have planned to ask from our panelists. So, as the first one, why do you think Kubernetes is still used by different cloud providers as managed service? Anything to add, Kanchana, from your end?
No, I'm probably going to ask Eric and Murali. I think the managed Kubernetes space is growing compared to customers, deploying their own Kubernetes onto public cloud. So maybe Murali or Eric can answer first, and then we can go for a bit of a discussion.
Well, sure. I can say what we did at Citi while I was there. I left about 1.5 years ago, and before that I was leading cloud migration for one of the divisions. We had chosen OpenShift as Kubernetes on the idea that this could be used anywhere. We had a private cloud internally built for us by Dell, and we deployed initially internally, and then we were moving to AWS. We did a pilot for that. I did that myself, and we found it was very difficult to fit OpenShift into all of the AWS cloud native services. So I think the value prop for the cloud providers to have a managed hosted Kubernetes is that they can integrate it with all their monitoring tools and security and reporting and analytics that are difficult to handle, as we found out when you're bringing a separate Kubernetes product into the cloud. They, at the time, were not as mature, and in the consumer part of the bank, they were trying to use EKS from Amazon and found a lot of security challenges. But I believe they have been working on those the last year and a half or so and have solved most of them. But I think it's anything else for them. Part of the value proposition of moving applications to the cloud, Kubernetes is the default deployment, and providing it as a service and integrating with all their other services is how they try to attract and keep customers and compete with one another.
So, thank you, Eric. Murali, anything you might want to add in terms of your experience of manage versus, bring your own?
Actually, you're on mute.
Eric's question is, Eric's answer is like pretty valid. You get to use the native services of the cloud provider if you use the managed service, right? So just to add on top of it, the next thing that I can think of is support, right? Like, if let's say you are building your own Kubernetes stack on top of let's say AWS, then who is responsible for support, right? So that's probably one of the reasons why people are trying to adopt the managed services. And to add kind of a another paradigm is the ramp up time is pretty fast if you are trying to use managed services. Like you don't have to deal with automation, you don't have to train your team to or expose them to tools like K3s or some other tools like OpenShift or Rancher, right? So you can just start and then start running your applications. So probably these are some of the reasons. And the other reason that I can think of is if you are a customer who is trying to run Kubernetes on-prem, then pretty much you don't have much options there, right? So you would end up going with building your own Kubernetes stack. So in that case, even if you expand your footprint to the cloud, you would end up building your own Kubernetes stack, because it's kind of natural. You have built the stack for on-prem, so you're just extending it to the cloud. So these are some of the reasons I can think of why people would work with managed services versus build their own stack.
Thank you, Murali. I think that's probably why I think especially Google gone another step ahead, isn't it? Like the Google GK Autopilot, they call it, which is completely managed and kind of serverless Kubernetes in GCP, where you don't have to even figure out how many nodes and things like that you want, and they'll actually do that for you. Yeah. Thank you very much, both of you. Kemila, are we moving on to the next question, or do you want me to ask the next question? Or?
Chamod will ask the next question. Chamod.
Okay.
Right.
So the second question is, why do you think rather than Docker Swarm, Kubernetes got popular with a huge hype? Any specific reasons?
Should I take that?
Go ahead, Eric.
Go for it.
Yeah, I look at this, try to look at this a bit from first principles. And I remember I was attending a conference in 2015, HPTS in California. We had a speaker from Google, his name was John Wilkes, and he gave us a talk about Borg, and he gave us a demo of Borg. And this is where Kubernetes comes from. It was developed initially as Borg by Google and open sourced into Kubernetes together with Red Hat and some other companies, I think, as we know the story. And his demo was to show how he could deploy 10,000 copies of a simple Hello World program in a matter of seconds using Borg. And I think what's very important about Kubernetes is that it's solving a very important problem in cloud computing, which is, as he mentioned, he was showing these arrays of commodity servers, which I think you can see if you check for Google data centers or Azure data centers or Amazon data centers, you see racks and racks of consumer grade hardware. This is a huge difference from how we used to do systems on enterprise grade mainframes and servers made for specific loads and specific programs running on specific nodes. And in this environment where you're running on consumer grade hardware, you're running at very low cost, the lowest cost possible, but you have a highest failure rate compared to enterprise software. So what you need to do is to deliver, have a way to deliver multiple copies of programs so that if you have a failure, another copy is able to take its place. And in his presentation, he mentioned that for every 2,000 machine service deployments that you have in those large racks, it's very common to have more than 10 exits per day. And they expect this. And Kubernetes is really coming from this world of, I have consumer grade hardware, I have racks and racks of servers, I have the lowest cost approach to IT possible. But in order to make the low cost work, I have to be able to sustain the failure rates of consumer grade hardware and everything keeps going. And Kubernetes comes out of that and became the default way to deploy your container-based microservices to achieve all these benefits of cloud computing. And I think that's the key problem that it solves, and that's why it's becoming very popular.
Thank you, Eric. Murali, do you want to add anything, or do you want me to have a go?
Yeah. Eric covered like a very good point. Just the way a person, if I have to compare Kubernetes with a person, right? The technical aspects are the hard skills, right? And the soft skills are the community. We have a very vibrant community around the entire Kubernetes ecosystem. So that kind of helped, build the momentum and take it forward. That's the other point that I would like to add.
100% agree. Yeah, I think that was one of the biggest things that the community and Google and Red Hat and IBM, the early contributors, were able to do compared to Docker. I think Docker kept it to their heart, very close to right. They didn't get a lot of community involvement, so on and so forth. I think I kind of at one point saw like they were kind of almost going to create that as a proprietary thing for themselves, rather than engage with the community. We saw the same thing happen with Mesos. Mesos was open source, but they also did not entertain a lot of community, right? I think that was one of the other key things the Kubernetes got so popular, that the engagement with the communities was really big. And while those three were the biggest contributors back then, I think a lot of the others, there are a lot of others to actually contribute. Now they have kind of become, they are still significant contributors, but they are more like, less of a contributors rather than the majority of the other contributors.
Thank you very much, Kanchana.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
So, next question from me. So what's your perspective of using an open source monitoring and logging tool rather than going with a subscription one for a production environment? I know some of the companies highly recommend to use Stackdrive, ELK Stack, and Murali likewise some payable monitoring mechanism. Yeah, I think hope it's clear, Kanchana.
What's your thought?
Yes, the question is clear.
Yeah.
Question is clear. Eric, Murali, do you want me to kind of repeat the question, or you guys got the question?
I'm okay. Murali,
Yeah, I'm
you want to
okay.
start this one?
Yeah, I'm okay. Yeah.
You want to start this one, Murali? I started the last
Yeah,
two.
sure. I can take this one. So, if I understand correctly, why would somebody build their own monitoring stack versus use some subscription model, right? Just to make sure, right? So, my take is it's all dependent on business needs, right? So most of the times, let's say if you're a startup, you don't have much time to build out the tech team around monitoring, build that focus, build that automation, scale out everything, right? So what you would do is you consume the readily available stacks, and once you grow beyond a certain critical mass, then you would probably evaluate, okay, does it make sense? The cost to value ratio, does it still make sense? Does the subscription make sense, or would it make sense if we build out our own stack? Would there be cost benefits? Would we have better control on the infrastructure and things like that, right? So these discussions are kind of a natural progression as the teams evolve from small size to bigger size. So it's more on the business requirements, I think. There's no hard and fast rule, depending on a particular business needs or a team's needs.
Absolutely, completely agree. One thing I could add is there's an inertia factor sometimes. For example, at Citi, they were using Splunk very extensively, and the natural thought was, let's just keep using it, even when we're going to the cloud. It sometimes is difficult to rethink the problem in the context that you just explained, Murali, which is the sensible way to do it. If you've made a decision years ago that you just want to stick with for some reason, or some people do, so that may create a challenge for some to do so. But I think it is some important question to rethink, especially moving to the cloud.
Absolutely. Yeah, add to that, Eric. Yeah, I think previously like NBN, similarly, they also continue to use Splunk, even though it became quite expensive. It is also at the same time quite challenging to move on to either an open source or another product, right? That's also in their minds. I think the subscription-based monitoring and observability teams products have become really smart in terms of the way they charge, right? And we know even Azure Analytics or Slackdriver, they charge for the gigabytes of data that you actually push, and that can grow really, really rapidly over time with microservices, right? So, yeah, I think closing on that one, I think like Murali and Eric said, it's pretty hard to say that whether you should go on one or the other. But if it's a startup, I think it's kind of highly recommended. You start with some of the readily available SaaS tools rather than actually going to try and establish your own stack, because you can actually spend quite a lot of effort and time and money also actually getting resources to do that.
Thanks,
Okay,
Back
guys.
to you guys.
Thank you.
So, next question is, do you think over time the dominance of VMware will fade away with companies such as Google AWS is starting to offer Kubernetes to run bare metal in their private data center? Or do you think most of the customers will move to manage Kubernetes services in public cloud providers and decommission VMware infrastructures?
I think it's kind of into two questions, isn't it? So
Yeah.
maybe we should break it up. I think the first part of the questions, I think Chamod was trying to ask whether the dominance of VMware will fade away because Google and AWS and others are coming into your own data center with their own Anthos and Google Outpost and Azure HCI stacks, or whether they will actually completely forget about all that as the second question and just use public cloud.
Yeah.
Maybe Murali, you want to go with this
sure.
one?
Yeah, sure. So my thought process is like, VMware still has a stronghold in majority of the enterprises, right? So the main reason is it works pretty flawlessly for most of the business use cases. And the reason why people still use their own infrastructure is because of the data security. There will be compliance reasons, there will be some other reasons where a particular company doesn't want to push out the sensitive data out into the cloud, right? So in that case, VMware makes sense. So as long as that particular need is present, VMware or any of the other bare metal providers like Nutanix, they're not going away. And again, like building Kubernetes stacks versus managed services, again, like we just had that discussion, right? Like it depends. Yeah, it again depends. Yeah.
Anything to add, Eric?
I think VMware is on the way out, basically. It's going to take a very, very long time. As Murali said, it's very well established and a lot of people are still using it and still finding value in it. But the original reason it was created to virtualize the operating system in a large data center and to create virtual machines independently for applications and developers to segment resources of the operating system. This reason is really not very compelling in the industry anymore for something like VMware to exist. When you look at the cloud architectures of hundreds and thousands of machines, they're more interested in the operating system level and the Kubernetes level, the deployment level, the container level of things than they are in the virtualization. And in those environments, virtualization can add an overhead which may not be helpful. So I think the original reason VMware was created was for the scale-up environment, to segment, to break it up into smaller pieces. And now in the cloud, everything is broken up into smaller pieces already. And so I think over time, the innovation is going to come more at the operating system level than at the virtual machine level for that environment going forward.
Yeah, I think you both covered it really, really well. And I also think, like both of you said, VMware got a very strong foothold, so it's going to take a while to, fed their, implement, I guess, install base, I would say. We yet to see what Broadcom will do, but I don't think customers will jump the ship just because it got acquired by Broadcom, right? Yeah.
I don't think so, but I also wonder whether Broadcom can sustain innovation and a future vision for that for VMware.
That's right. That's a very valid point too. Yeah. Thank you, Eric and Murali, on that one. Back to you guys.
Yes, Chamod. Yes, Kanchana. Sorry. So next question is about managing complex application. So when managing complex distribution application on KH is still a challenge, So many companies are coming with application packaging frameworks, to name few: Open Application Model, Dapper, and most recently Archon Labs. So what's your thoughts on that actually so far?
It's a difficult question because the reason, as we talked earlier about, the reason Kubernetes was developed was to deploy small pieces of code onto small computers, hundreds and hundreds of small computers automatically. And yet Kubernetes has no inherent restriction on running large applications and large programs. It's very possible to take a monolithic Java EE server and run it in a Kubernetes pod, given its sufficient resources. It's not the best way to use Kubernetes because it's not consistent with what the problem with Kubernetes was designed to solve, but it can be a transitional step. So I think the companies who are thinking of this, and we, this is one of the reasons at Citi when I actually introduced OpenShift into Citi and ran the initial proof of concepts and did the first applications on it. And one of the reasons we chose it in my division over Cloud Foundry, for example, was Cloud Foundry was much too strict on the 12 factors, and they also didn't have capability to run the data tier very well at that time, which was 2015, I think. Anyway, it served us better because we had a way to make the transition in steps to the microservices world that we wanted to get to. But microservices being such a different way to compose and run and manage applications, it requires some investment and some re-engineering, and it's not possible to do that all at once. So OpenShift and Kubernetes version of OpenShift's version of Kubernetes allowed that transition to be taking place gradually. So I think that there's some often confusion between the fact you can run something on Kubernetes and what you should really be running on Kubernetes. Just because it works doesn't mean it's the right thing to run there. And it may take some time for that to become apparent and for that scenario to play out, especially as companies move through that transition from monolith to microservices.
Thank you, Eric. Murali,
Yeah, sure.
add anything to that?
Yeah. Just a slightly different perspective, but it's very similar to what Eric just mentioned, right? So Kubernetes was never designed with the intention that it would be consumed by the end users, right? So you always need some kind of an abstraction or some kind of management layer on top of it, which would make it easy to work with the entire Kubernetes stack. And platforms like OpenShift, Rancher attempted to do that, and they got a lot of adoption. And obviously the next progression is how do you simplify app deployment? How do you compose the entire app specification? People fell in love with the Docker user experience, right? It was so simple. If you look at Kubernetes manifest files, like nobody can author one from scratch. Like if you look at a simple Docker compose file, you could probably just hand write it, like, or hand code it, right? You can't do that with any of the Kubernetes manifest file. You need to copy paste, or you need to use some kind of a generator. Although there are like other wrappers on top of it, but still, it's not easy. So
Quite complex, isn't it?
it's quite complex. So I think it's kind of a natural progression, but at least now what has happened is Kubernetes has become the de facto standard, just like Linux kernel, right? It's adopted, huge adoption, and very similar to what how the Linux environment evolved, right? I remember back in my college days, I used to have like 3 CDs of this Linux distribution, and getting it to install on my desktop was a pain. It was very difficult. Like the drivers wouldn't work, the network card doesn't come out, hacking, a lot of stuff, right? But now if you look at it, you just have a USB stick, you plug it in, boom, you have everything installed, right? So in the same way, Kubernetes, the whole ecosystem would evolve, where it would be like just plug and play. So that's why all these companies are trying to solve that user experience problem.
Exactly. I think the one which is very, very new, I think the newest the newest kid on the block is your former co-founders, the Rancher co-founders, has gone and created this thing called Archon Labs, and I'm really interesting to hear what they have to say. I think if I'm not mistaken, I think Darren is planning to do a technical demo in this KCD. So hopefully we'll get to hear from him as well. Yeah. So
yes, I happened to I think the first meetup actually last. I think probably Wednesday or Thursday we had the first online meetup, and I.
That's right. Yeah, I missed it because it was kind of too late in the day for me. But interesting to hear what they have to say. They come up with a completely different way of kind of packaging the applications, right?
Yeah.
To a certain extent, I think some of the other tools are also trying to do similar, a way of simplifying it. But yeah, that's right. I think it's evolving, right? It's not going to. Kubernetes. I think Eric. I think when we talk about it like it's the new Linux of the cloud, right?
Well, I think Murali said it's the new standard for deployment. And
that's right.
You get a standard like this. And I think I was also a good comparison of the evolution of Linux. At one time was not a standard operating system. And over time, once you establish a standard, you can start working above it and start to abstract it. And that's what we're seeing, I think, in the marketplace as well. Kanchana and Murali's a number of companies now coming out, ourselves included, with the capability of abstracting across Kubernetes for applications that are deployed on them. And I think that's very much the next logical step as well, including not just the tools, but also abstracting many common application capabilities.
Right. I think we are right at the top of the hour. Is there any other questions or things that?
Thank you very much, Kanchana, Murali, and Eric. Yeah, that was a great session. We honor to be here. Back to you, Chirag.